Well, thank you, Catherine. Really great work you've been doing, you and your colleagues at BCG, and a really great table setting for this discussion here. I'm Nicholas Eisenberger. I'm a longtime investor and entrepreneur in the DAC space. Believe it or not, have been involved in DAC for 18 years. Know many of you. So great to see so many of you here, old friends and so many new. This is a really important moment. We've come a long way. We've really, really come a long way in the last 18 years. I can definitely attest to that, and I know many of you have the bumps and bruises, as well as the satisfaction of seeing how far we've come. But this is a really important transitional moment. We are going from an idea, from pure innovation, of which there has been much, and there should remain much for many years to come, but we also have to start shifting the weight towards deployment. And we're doing that at a major moment of uncertainty, geopolitically, and certainly here in the United States. So as has already come up in this conversation here, what we're trying to do is collectively think about how do we get through, how do we scale from where we are, build on the progress, and go forward and deploy. So today's discussion, we're really so fortunate to have several folks here who are really working on the front lines and have deep expertise in this question of how do you finance a DAC project or a DAC-related project. So I'm going to pass it off down the row here. I'd like to ask each of you to just introduce yourself, and Catherine, you've introduced yourself a little bit, but just give us a little bit of a feel of how your day-to-day work, in brief, intersects with project finance. Again, in your case, it might be a little obvious, but over to you.
Hi, everyone. So I already did the high-level intro, but specifically for project finance, I think there's two things to call out. One is that at BCG, we do a lot of due diligences for projects of all kinds. So I've done many of those, can bring that experience. But much more relevantly, I spent the past 6 months working with 2 startups and helping them with their first-of-a-kind plants, and specifically trying to reach a final investment decision. So this is checking off the 5 risks that I showed. We have like a much more detailed checklist behind that, and trying to help them check off as many of those components as they could to get the investor on board with the projects. One of them was CDR related, one of them was not, but can kind of bring a lot of that expertise. We built techno-economic models, we talked to customers, we built pitch materials. It's just like a lot of the different components that it takes to get a project developed enough to get an investor.
That's great. Phil?
Hi, everyone. My name is Phil DeLuna. I'm the Chief Science and Commercial Officer at Deep Sky. We are a technology-agnostic project developer based in Canada, and our goal is to remove lots of CO2 from the atmosphere. We were founded on the premise that in other clean energy and clean technology verticals, whether that's wind or solar or others, there are technology developers and there are project developers. As these industries scaled and matured, there was a natural segmentation, a specialization in that value chain, in that market. There's a reason why GE and Siemens build wind turbines, but Ørsted builds wind projects. And we thought that this exact missing piece is what is needed in carbon removal. So our founders built Deep Sky to be a company that finds technologies to partner with, the best in the world, to build large direct air capture projects, that will source the land, that will drill and own the wells and all of the associated risk and liability that comes along with it, which is something that I really appreciated Brian from JP Morgan speak about earlier this morning, to make projects financeable and bankable. We procure energy, we operate the units, we do the community engagement, stakeholder management, we have all of the political connections and meetings in order to get these things through and this legislation passed in Canada. My role at the company, I'm responsible for offtakes, helping our CEO fundraise and strategic partnerships. And this year, our first project is coming online in the coming months, which is Deep Sky Alpha, a technology-agnostic project development, or a technology-agnostic demonstration center, where we're bringing up to 8 different direct air capture technologies from around the world to Canada to test them side by side, see how they operate. And the best that we identify there, we're going to scale and build large-scale commercial projects. That project cost $50 million to build in CapEx, and it's going to cost another $50 million over the next 10 to 15 years to operate, so $100 million in total. And throughout the panel, I could talk about how we raise that money and how we're able to finance it. But then really what I have my eyes set on going forward is our first commercial projects, which we're set to start drilling our wells this summer in 2 locations across Canada. One deep sedimentary saline aquifer storage, and another shallow in-situ mineralization storage well. And I can talk about the sort of troubles and struggles and challenges of trying to project finance something like that. And first of a kind is hard, but it's fun.
Thanks, Phil. Richard?
Yeah, I'm Richard. Hi, I'm Richard Kauffman. I'm the chair of Generate Capital, which is a owner and operator of sustainable infrastructure, and I'm CEO of the Coalition for Green Capital, which received a $5 billion grant under the IRA to establish a national green bank.
Thanks, Richard. Let's jump right into it. You two are both really operating at the front lines recently of really trying to get some projects financed in this space. You talked about, Katherine, your 5 risks. That's a lot. What can you distill out for folks who might be thinking about projects? How did the team go about trying to prioritize and segment that? And what can you share that's worked and not worked from trying to push those risks down?
Yeah, so I think I would call out a few things. One is the technology risk. BCG is not, well, I do have a PhD, but BCG is not well equipped to address. And we really left that to the engineering team, and the normal scale-up process will do that of we're in the lab, we're moving to a demo scale, et cetera. So we focused really on more the commercial risk and pulling all the partners together, and specifically trying to find partners that will help you de-risk, but won't introduce new risks. Not to just overuse the word risk, but when it's particularly thinking about the SPV setup, finding an EPC who will work with you and who's willing to do a first of a kind that maybe sees your platform as a growth platform, and setting those up correctly. On the commercial side, I think getting the techno-economics right so that you know what kind of price range you're going to be in, which is obviously hard if you haven't actually proven out the tech enough to know exactly where you'll be, but get some sort of sense so that you can have the discussions early enough, because they do take time. I know I talk to the BCG purchasing team a lot, and it takes a year from initial conversations to actually signing something or more. And so if you're trying to get to the investment decision in a year's time and you haven't reached out to off-takers yet, you're kind of on the late side. And so helping them get to that point quicker and identifying who to reach out to.
Phil, you've been trying to get Alpha going, and I believe you either I don't know if you had to get external financing for that, but I know now you're definitely thinking about how to forward finance your ongoing commercial operations. What are you seeing out there, and what can you share that both key opportunities and challenges as you're trying to put that financing together?
Yeah, I wish I had a playbook, a miraculous secret sauce. But the reality is, the reason we were able to raise the funding that we raised is because of our founders. And that's how it goes. If you have a founder that our founders, Fred and Joost, built Hopper, which is a 5 to 10-ish, depending on what day of the week, billion-dollar company in Canada that sells travel. They started planting trees to offset the emissions of their customers, and that started them with their climate journey. And they realized that 1, planting trees, while very important, lots of co-benefits is not enough, and 2, climate change is happening way faster than expected. And what they did is they saw this gap in the market for this project development, and they went to all of their existing investor base, institutional investors, pension funds, banks, governments, and said, the climate is really important. This is the biggest financial risk, long-term risk, that any of your funds are going to experience in our lifetime, whether that's agricultural loss, whether that's insurance that's no longer being able to be paid out, whether that's economic strife, mass migration, the list goes on and on and on and on. You have to do something about this. And Canada is the best place in the world to do it. So they gave a really good pitch. So for Alpha, we raised 75 million in a Series A, Canadian, so about 57 million in real money. And that allowed us to get started. That allowed us to develop and build and procure pilots, et cetera. But there was a huge gap that only covers about the CapEx of it. And so we were able to find partners in Breakthrough Energy Catalyst to provide us a $40 million non-dilutive grant to fund a little bit of that operations, as well as get us over the hump to continue. And the only reason we were able to do that is because we were able to de-risk all of those commercial risks as much as possible before Breakthrough would even take a call with us, right? We brought on an EPC that had done this before, and it's important to also find EPCs that can be creative and recognize that a first-of-a-kind plant of a new technology is not the same as building a natural gas or LNG plant. One, it's much smaller, but two, it's much more flexible. So that's really important. We were able to sign offtakes. We signed 10-year agreements. Tenure is really, really important to show bankability in project finance. With Microsoft and the Royal Bank of Canada. We are actually the Royal Bank of Canada's first DAC purchase and technology carbon removal purchase in the entire organization ever. And a lot of that stuff, frankly, is because of the story that we built around being a Canadian company, building a Canadian project in a time where nation building is really important because of geopolitical situations that we didn't expect, we didn't anticipate, and half of life is luck and timing. I don't know if you would call it lucky where we are today, but we're taking advantage of it. And so that's kind of how we were able to get Alpha off the ground. When it comes to getting our next projects off the ground, the conversations we've had with project financiers, Brian said it best this morning, being able to ensure that there's one counterparty across the supply chain is critical. The fact that we're actually drilling and owning our own storage wells and building direct air capture on top of those locations to eliminate the need for transportation completely eliminates multiple chains of custody liability, the transfer, the legality of it. Canada also has a really great policy and regulation environment. We don't have the Class 6 well permitting process. Every province has their own destiny in their hands. It's as if they all have primacy. And the best standard right now, which is in Alberta, where we're building our first project, the Crown owns the subsurface. So you only have to deal with one subsurface pore space landowner. The Crown owns liability 30 years post-closure. So if you do your job and you monitor, you report, you verify, you close it after 20 years, you monitor it for 20 years after that, 20, 30 years after that, then the Crown takes all the liability afterwards. So these are really important project considerations about where you build and how you build that actually unlock a project being bankable and financeable. And unfortunately, the secret is much of that is outside of your control, much of it. So one of the first hires that we brought into Deep Sky was a VP of Government Relations and Public Policy, because we recognize that so much of it is public relations or public policy, community engagement, et cetera, getting the local counselors on your side, writing letters to the premiers, equivalent to governors, and advocating for the project on your behalf. That is so crucial, and you have to start now.
So I'm going to distill for him Phil's major message for this panel: come to Canada. Well, it's a joke, but it's also serious. I mean, and it is a great opportunity what you guys are doing up there, both Deep Sky and beyond, and necessary, a really positive ingredient in the overall mix. What I'm hearing from both of you is not surprising. It's a lot of blocking and tackling, right? You got to find ways to, as a friend of mine used to say, you got to get frogs in the bucket. The deal's not going to happen if frogs are jumping out of the bucket. You just got to systematically try to manage these risks down to a place where they're just not an obstacle. But we also need to figure out where all the dollars come from, right? And so there's venture capital, there's government grants, there's concessionary capital. That may end up adding up to, if you need $100 for a project, I don't know, $72. I'm just making this up. But it's not $100, right? It's not 100 cents on the dollar. So Richard, I know you've been thinking about this for a long time, working. Richard and I had the great privilege to work with Richard tangentially in some of the early run-up of how do we finance solar and wind and batteries. And he was a real pioneer in the green bank effort. standing up the New York Green Bank, and now, as you heard, the CEO of the Coalition for Green Capital. What role, Richard, you've seen this movie before, or a version of it. How has that played out? How do you think that might play out here, and what role can green banks play in, closing that gap on the 100 cents?
Well, I guess what I would say is that, project finance is going to be really important here. Project finance is going to be important because very few entities are going to want to buy the equipment themselves. They're going to want to buy the DAC as a service. And so that means the cash flows from the project have to support the project equity and the project debt. So you talked about solar and wind and batteries. So there are elements of this movie we know that are going to be the same. So what's the same? Well, some of the risks we've already talked about. Counterparty risk, how long a tenure of the contracts, technology risk, we've talked about that, including O&M and construction costs. I think the other thing that is the same is, and maybe has gotten arguably worse, is the limitation on traditional bank financing. There are very few banks that are in the project financing business. They're mostly European banks, and banks really, for a variety of reasons, have either regulatory reasons or just their cost of service makes it very difficult for them to lend to projects that have a long tenor or have any technology risk, or smaller projects, things would be below investment grade. So this is something that we've had to navigate with other parts of the market. And so that's, I think, one of the things that's different this time, and I think I can give a more positive, in spite of everything that's going on, I can give a more positive outlook for the ability to get project financing, at least as far as the debt is concerned. Because there's really been institutional change since the days of wind and solar and batteries. And the institutional change really comes in two parts. One is, you mentioned green banks, one are green banks, and the other is the rise of private credit funds. And so with respect to green banks, I mean, that's really why green banks have been in existence. You mentioned New York. It's because there are these gaps in traditional bank lending, and the problem is not the cost of capital often, but the availability of capital, for all the reasons I said. Smaller projects, below investment grade. And so an example of this where green banks can really incubate a financing structure is in community solar. So rooftop solar was well known by the banking sector, but community solar, where there's an installation not on somebody's roof but miles away, banks were saying, how do we know somebody's going to really pay? What's going to happen when somebody moves? And so the New York Green Bank incubated the financing structure, figure out how to mitigate the risk through the structure, and then built a portfolio of loans to demonstrate that the loans were creditworthy. And as a result of that incubation, again, the incubation of both the structure and the quantity of loans, seasoning the loans, the private sector has now taken over. So that's an example of what we can see, because it's the flexibility that a green bank can provide that's different from the structures of a traditional bank. Because when we say green bank, it's a non-bank bank. It's not regulated in the same way. And then I think just in terms of the private credit market, these are organized by traditional asset managers. So again, they're not going to have the same regulatory structure issues, and they're interested in yield. So they'll have the same questions about some of the risks that we're talking about. But they're going to have an incentive, actually, in contrast to a bank, to take on things that have higher yielding, because they will have a direct financial return on doing that in terms of a fund structure, which is fundamentally different than the way a bank would view risk. So I'm just going to end by saying that Phil talked about the word bankability. We really should think about that the term bankability really means something quite different now, because the projects, certainly I would say many of the projects are going to be financed not with traditional banks.
That's great news to hear that you really see across, looking back from where we might have been in 2010 on wind and solar and the financing landscape, that we've really kind of put in place some foundational support for emerging technologies to
Yeah,
get
I'm sorry, there's one other thing I was going to say, because it goes to, something I meant to say, because it went to Catherine's point on one of her slides. So one of the challenges here when we talk about industrial users is the fact that there could be multiple solutions brought together. And that's something that is really difficult for traditional project financing. They're just not used to having different revenue streams or different technology providers, all that. That's really down the center of the fairway for how a green bank or and eventually a private credit fund will look at things. But again, really a null set for traditional bank project financing.
So we have these new sort of layers that are in place, but I just have to say, it's very hard. I've personally experienced, I know a lot of people in the room experience it, you've experienced it. It's kind of hard and lonely to check all these boxes and get all these frogs in the bucket. I mean, it's tough stuff. So if you try to expand from, one individual project sponsor to what we might think about the ingredients for getting us there faster as a ecosystem, as a marketplace. I'd just like to explore some ideas that you may have had in your work, and I wish we could have, so for me, for example, I don't think we need that much money to get DAC into a place where it's bankable. I just don't think the amount of capital is that significant. We're only talking single-digit billions would be my guess, totally, to get a number of pathways, different technological pathways in DAC to a place where they've got enough cycles, they're clearly on a cost curve and a reliability curve where you can now get private financing. Well, that's my theory. I'd love to, aggregate those single-digit billions and deploy them rapidly to try to do that. Other ideas that you guys are working on the front line to how can we make this go faster? Other than just checking the boxes.
Yeah, I can say one idea that touches on a few is places where you can share something that took a lot of time to develop, but it's like that you can share so that other people can save that time, so that you're not like on your own as a tech developer trying to do these things. And the specific thing I have in mind is like an offtake agreement would be one, like a term sheet for an offtake agreement. BCG has lawyers that do this, like no, it's not one person's full-time job, but we have full-time lawyers who can spend time on this. I've worked with companies that, I know Frontier has put one out. We're talking to someone who might also put out another one of, here's just an offtake agreement that you can use as a starting point, so you don't have to start from literally like Googling because you have no idea what you're doing. And if there's other things like that, and I think this gets at the point we made of like something I think buyers can do of, hey, here's our selection criteria for how we think about choosing a DAC company, so a buyer can kind of enter more easily. It's just lowering those transaction barriers, I think, is something that some people might view as giving up IP, but I think just really can accelerate kind of what you're saying of like, it's not a dollar thing, it's just, hey, here's an offtake agreement, save yourself like weeks of trying to figure this out while you're tackling all these other frogs.
So lower transaction costs. I certainly saw that in wind and solar, that they were very high at the beginning and they had to come down. Phil, how about any thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with the premise of being able to reduce the friction of a transaction, and by sharing tools like this. My one caveat to that is that every buyer is a little bit different. And so if you start off with a template of what a term sheet could look like to get the conversation going, that's great. But every customer wants something different. Some want it for the PR, some want it because they want to retrade, some want to bundle the credit with their actual product so they can sell a green premium on their product. Every sector, every customer is different. It's a great starting point to get the conversation started, but it's just the starting point. So just to clarify that, we should lower the transaction costs or the friction, but they're still going to be there. Unsurprisingly, of course, increasing demand is going to be the biggest thing that we can try to accelerate project development. And this might be a controversial take, but I think one of the reasons that we talked about earlier, yes, price is obviously one thing, risk and liability across all these different parties is another thing, education, understanding that the concentric circles outside of our own circle, getting them to understand why this is important. But the other piece is that there's just a lot of confusion. There's a lot of companies out there that are talking about prices that they aren't real. There are a lot of companies out there that are raising money in making deals or announcing deals that when you push it a little bit, you don't really see the substance behind it. And that creates a lot of confusion, because if you're a buyer and then you see a DAC company sell a credit for $100 per ton, but it's Ford sold to 2035 beyond, and you see another company that's selling a DAC credit for $1,000 per ton on their website to small buyers right now, that's just very confusing. And so I think actually what's going to happen, and this isn't, I don't wish this to happen, but the next 2 years there's going to be many companies that are going to fold. And that's just because there's not enough capital in order to get them to the next stage. And that's healthy, that's normal, that's a good thing because it shows maturity. But what I also hope that does is it starts to consolidate a little bit more of the market around who are real. What are actual technologies that have promise, that are going to get the cost down? The best way to get costs down is learning rates, and you have to deploy to do that. And we need to actually deploy and not just talk about what we're deploying or make deals on things that aren't real yet. And so I really hope that sort of consolidation and it's show me time kind of attitude leads to an acceleration and a backing around the projects that are actually going to make it.
Yeah, and if I can build with 2 more points on that. One is on this point of learning rates. We did a study, and it was now like 2 or 3 years ago, but a lot of times people talk about, with every doubling, you get a cost reduction of a certain amount. But that's actually, it's not DAC, because DAC is a bunch of technologies. And so actually some consolidation helps you start spending the dollars to double in size and get the learnings and improve the costs on the technologies that will end up winning. And that you can actually, it's actually very important that we do that, because for every doubling, it then also costs more. Every doubling, it's a volume doubling. So if you build a 1 megaton plant, you've doubled however many times to get there, but to double again, you then need to build another 1 megaton plant, right? It's not, so the scale increases. And then I actually forgot my second point, so maybe we
Okay, so lower transaction costs, focus on what's workable. You both said that. Richard, as you think about that, are there systemic thinking or collaborations that you think might help make this go faster?
Well, so I want us to think about where we want to wind up, because, the benefit of everybody here in the room is you have a chance to shape the future. And so we should think about the financing structure or architecture where we want to eventually end. And that really takes us to the question about securitization, because that's one of the areas where I would say that in terms of lessons learned, this was a problem, I think, that securitization, is part of the residential solar world, but still a very small part of the renewables. And so when we think about long-dated assets, and you're trying to go to banks as opposed to the bond market, it's really kind of an unnatural act. And so one of the reasons why securitization didn't take place as quickly is because of tax equity, because those entities that got tax equity were using financing as a form of competition, as opposed to the way most businesses operate, which is to compete on the basis of service or product quality or cost. And so what that meant was that there was a reluctance to do the things that enable securitization, which is data. So Katherine talked about sharing. You know, you have, in order to get credit agencies to rate something, they need to see data. They need to see data on customer performance. They need to see data on technology and all of this. And so this is where, because I'm hoping that 45Q will, you know, allow for, you know, cash in lieu of tax equity, that the entities that will be in the business will not compete on the basis of access to financing, but instead will do things that will enable securitization. I said before that, you know, the private credit funds will have a significant interest in securitization in a way that, you know, probably banks don't. Banks as an institution, traditional banks as an institution, might have an interest in securitization, but when you actually drill down and think about the people that are doing project financing, they don't get the same financial incentives for securitization as somebody that works in a private credit fund. Because the difference, if you can originate projects and then securitize them, there's a significant increase in value of your debt investment.
In simple forms, Richard, can you just lay out what securitization in this context means for you or might mean in DAC?
Well, I mean, and it could be complicated because we're talking about, again, if we think about industrial solutions and what Phil said about sort of bespoke, but the essence of securitization is to aggregate small things. I mean, you know, credit cards are securitized, auto loans are securitized, lots of things are securitized. And it's a way to take a bunch of small things together that are basically homogeneous and put them in an instrument that is sold to the bond markets. And the essence or the way that you can do a securitization is you need to have, again, you need to have the data that a credit agency is going to rate, but you also need to have the underlying contracts and the nature of the projects that are the same or close enough to being the same.
If I may just respond to that really quickly. Richard, to your point on securitization, I think what really unlocks is tradability, right? And markets grow when people can make money. And so being able to securitize something like DAC means that people can make money off of it. And I'm curious, what do you, sorry if I'm taking over your question part, but I'm curious, how do you see, I always tell customers that we're in a pre-compliance market. Eventually, compliance markets are going to emerge, and DAC credits, carbon removal credits are going to go there. When the world is burning, governments will pay what they need to pay in order to protect their citizens. I believe that. Look at the pandemic. People paid what they needed to pay for the mRNA vaccine. We are all, maybe one of us is a Moderna. How does securitization play into compliance markets? And do you think that that's a step towards that, or are they complementary, or could they be, incompatible?
Well, I think this goes to the point you said about the demand side, right? The demand of projects. So as I'm hearing the development of a compliance market, it means there'll be more projects. So I think the point I'm making about securitization, it's a well-developed financial instrument. There have been trillions of dollars of securitations that have been done.
Think mortgages, right?
You know, I mean,
it's massive financial
and again,
flows.
it solves the problem that when we talk about banks don't really want to be in the business. The banks really have a financial incentive to reduce their balance sheets. So and so things that have long duration. I mean, obviously it started with the mortgage business, but the idea that you can go to institutional investors. Banks don't want to be in the business of lending. Banks are funded with short-term deposits. That's a liability. And so you want to match, if you're a bank, you want to match the duration of your assets and your liabilities. So if you're largely financed with short-term deposits, you do not want to be in the business of making long-term loans, because when interest rates go up, you wind up going out of business. So so that's why the securitization market solved the problem, because institutional investors are actually interested in long-dated assets, interested in long bonds, And so that was the brilliance of this financial instrument. And I think that since we're talking about, again, many of the projects are going to be small, $75 million maybe, that's considered small. Some of the projects, and there are going to be many projects, and they're going to have long tenure. The natural answer is to evolve towards the securitization market.
So, this is maybe a few steps out from where we're all today, but I think it's really important to say what are we skating towards and why, right? And you can bundle up and sell off, massive amounts of CDR, right? That's the long-term goal is what I hear Richard saying.
Yeah, because, and I'm sorry just to say this, because, we talk about technology costs. A dollar of cost is a dollar of cost. And if you can get access to the bond market, which is this incredibly liquid market, it absolutely reduces the cost of capital.
Yeah. Unlocking trillions of dollars of capital. That's the end game. Let's take it back just a couple steps to where folks might be today. A little bit of a controversial topic in these circles, but business model. How does that play in at this moment? And maybe it evolves over time into folks who are involved in DAC projects getting their project financed.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a first stab because Deep Sky, the innovation for Deep Sky as a company is actually our business model. My background is I'm a technology developer by heart, by training. I'm a scientist. And when I heard about what Deep Sky was doing, I didn't understand it. I was like, what do you mean you don't develop the technology and you want to build a project? I don't understand that. And then I realized, oh my God, this is brilliant. Why doesn't anyone do this? Why is this not a thing? Oh, they do it in everywhere else. How come they're not doing it here? So I think what's going to happen, like we've seen in oil and gas, in solar, in wind, and in basically every large infrastructure project, is the business model of a project developer will, which is really, I think, a big missing piece, will only continue to build. And Richard, to your point about taking a few things and bundling to get them together, when Microsoft and RBC purchased credits from us, they didn't say we want this technology that you're piloting. They said we want a Deep Sky credit, and we trust that you're going to be our portfolio in a portfolio, that you are going to find the best technologies, and we don't care which technology it is, what's in the black box. We care about the inputs and outputs, what it's going to cost, how much energy it's going to use, how good is that credit and fungible is that credit as it comes out. And that was a huge unlock for me, which is we actually do have to bundle things together. And I think what's starting to happen is, we heard from Climeworks earlier, Climeworks became a project developer almost out of necessity, right? Because they were a technology developer, they actually had a business model to sell their units for a while, and then they realized there wasn't a market for that yet. They had to build that market. They realized that there weren't any project developers. They had to become a project developer. But there isn't enough capital for the 150 DAC companies to all become Climeworks and become project developers themselves. So what we're starting to see is more and more DAC companies realizing, wait a second, I can actually sell these units now. There's actually a market to sell these units, whether that's small-scale utilization. One of our partners, Skytree, sells their units into greenhouses for utilization directly on site, or whether that's for e-fuel production, or whether that's for DAC, whatever it may be. We're starting to see more and more companies realize that actually the OEM model might make sense because the cost to get all those frogs in that bucket and the time to get all those frogs in that bucket and the skills to get all those frogs in that bucket are completely different than developing a technology, and to do both at the same time is incredibly expensive. So would you rather have a technology that you cost down and works and get to the market faster, or would you rather spend your time getting frogs in buckets?
Catherine?
Yeah,
what advice do you have for folks doing projects?
And this is exactly why I like the Deep Sky model, is there is so much important role for that, because the pure project development component is so complicated and it's such different skills than the technology development. I do think that there are some technologies that can scale faster and like more benefit. I think carbon engineering, now Oxy, and then also Heimdall fit into this. Of like they kind of use large scale inputs. They maybe don't need, their advantage is more in the product development side. And so there are companies that I think don't necessarily need to follow that model, but otherwise I think that model can be really powerful. I do think not so much business model, but in terms of given there are so many different technologies, I think that the finding off-takers can be challenging. So it's nice when the developer can do it, but even if not, I think it's very important for companies to have not just a business model, but a real value proposition of like, this is what we're bringing, this is what you're getting from me, unlike others. And maybe that's, like to what you mentioned earlier, maybe that's a credit in 2026, maybe that's a much cheaper credit in 2035, like whatever it is, just being very clear about what that is and using that to help you find the right off-takers and finding the customers that.
So what I'm hearing is not necessarily one size fits all in business model, not necessarily one answer, but be clear, be intentional about what your business model is and why, and whether that needs to evolve over time and whether it plays to your strengths. Richard, you were about to say something.
Yeah. I mean, these are two different businesses, right? The development business and the technology business are two different businesses. And so I know as an investor, I always view it as a red flag when people want to do both, particularly if you're talking about a smaller company. If you're really great at technology, you would want every developer in the world to be selling your product. If you're a great developer, why do you want to be constrained by your own technology? Now, having said that, I understand why an emerging technology, a technology company needs to develop projects to show that the technology works. I understand that. But at some point, my view would be that that company needs to migrate away from being in the development business. It needs to decide what it's going to be. And if it's in the technology business, it needs to evolve away from being a project developer. Now, having said that, I think that we also have to be aware of the role of capital, because during the heyday of a couple years ago, again, not in this area, but in other renewable sectors, there was so much capital that was going into the market that companies that had technologies were encouraged by investors to be both in the development and the technology business. And the reason for that was, well, look, it's going to be great because you're going to be able to use the cash flows from projects to finance your development. And why do you want to keep going back to the market to raise new money for development? And also you can be a bigger company and you can be kind of like an IPP, an independent power producer, and use that model. And you can eventually sell the projects at a lower yield, which means a higher price. We're not in that kind of market now, but we need to be mindful of the combination of business model and what investors may eventually tell you that they want to do, which may not necessarily be in the best long-term interest of the business.
So be clear about what you want to be when you grow up. I can see the clock ticking down here. We may have time for one or two questions. Anyone have a burning question? While you're thinking about that, final words for folks in the room thinking about, really trying to get capital to finance projects, to push forward their technology. Final words of advice.
Come to Canada. No, I'm not even joking. We have a 60% investment tax credit that's federally funded, and that is going to persist. That's 60% of a discount on CapEx for all direct air capture projects. If you have behind-the-meter renewable power on top of that, that actually qualifies through what's called a dual-use provision. We have some of the fastest regulatory frameworks to get storage unlocked across the country. We have businesses and governments that want to support this stuff. We've got a ready workforce. I always tell people that what we're doing is oil and gas in reverse. Who better to be the workforce of the future than those in the oil and gas industry that want to transition away? We have all of that. So yeah, no, I genuinely believe if you want to build a project in the short term that is going to work and be profitable, do it in Canada.
I knew you were going to say that. That's great. Katherine.
Yeah, I was going to say find the right partners, particularly, maybe that's Deep Sky is one of them, but if you're really developing it yourself, finding the companies that can help you do the things you're not as good at, like finding the right EPC who can help you operate the plant and build the plant, and will partner with you long term, that's interested in the longer term, and there are many other examples, that right investors that will work with you now to develop the project and then will fund the next ones after that. But finding the partners that can help you de-risk the things that you're not as good at, so that you can unlock both your next project and the ones after that.
Thank you. Richard?
Well, we've been at this for a long time, and I would say that it really feels like now is almost now.
Well, I would say, to add on to the really great discussion here, you know, it is lonely to try to do this by yourself. And as the co-founder and chair of the DAC coalition, that's why we do this, right? That's what this meeting is for. That's what the coalition is for. We are here to try to break through all this more quickly, and it's because we have the willingness, and you guys all invest your time to come in for these discussions, and you to share your expertise, that we have the opportunity to do that. This is a really challenging time. Don't work in a silo. Don't feel like you're alone. We're all here in this together, and we have to succeed. So join me in thanking our panelists for this discussion.